Well, when I heard you for the first time put together a case as to why you think it was an eyewitness account, and I never even thought of it that way. You know, it's a different way of thinking.
Yes.
That you've done.
Well, because again, there's lots of theistic worldviews that are really a matter of a series of proverbial claims. They aren't like our claim in Christianity is an actual claim about history, an event that occurred in the past. It's not a set of proverbial wisdoms from a wise sage. It's actually a claim about a narrative that occurred in time. And when you have a claim about a narrative that occurs in time, that means you can either falsify it or verify it, because we're looking at an actual historical event. If the resurrection occurred, it would have had to occur in history, and somebody would have either seen it or not seen it. So we can actually take the same, this is also true, of course, of cold cases, of murders. These are events that occur in history. We've got to be able to take a look at those. And I often don't have access to the original eyewitnesses anymore, but I do have access to the reports. Or maybe I have access to a witness, and I'm really trying to determine, has that person's story changed over time? And you know, Leon, this is one of the things that I really, as a skeptic, had concerns about. I would have accepted some version of Jesus, I think. A wise rabbi in the first century, maybe made some claims. Maybe none of these were even prophetic claims, but had some wise teaching on moral behaviors. Certainly a very wise moral teacher. But I would have rejected anything supernatural. So in my mind, I always assumed that probably the best explanation for all the miraculous aspects of these accounts was that these things changed over time. That we start off with a very simple version of Jesus, and then through the centuries, Jesus becomes more and more elaborate. He's now working miracles. He's seen maybe his words are misinterpreted.
Right.
This idea that he claimed to be God is maybe a late. So the first thing I look at in a criminal case is I have similar problems in my criminal cases. So as I first started examining the claims of the Gospels, I just took the same approach I took as a detective. You know, for example, if someone tells me that there was a piece of evidence in the crime scene, and then 30 years later they're going to try to bring it into trial. Oh, I found this button, or I found this shell casing, or I found this hair. And here it is in court 30 years later. How do I really know that that was even at the crime scene? Yeah. For all I know, some lying detective could have dropped it in the property 5 years later. And now suddenly the person who came behind that detective had no idea it was a lie. They worked it like it was really evidence, and now years later some new detective is bringing it into trial as though it was part of the crime scene, when in fact it was never part of the crime scene. Right. How do I know if the same thing didn't happen with the Gospels?
They got more and more fluffed up as the years went by.
Stuff. Yeah.
So when you looked at the Gospels, you kind of wanted to know from the very, were these eyewitness accounts?
Yes, and did they change over time? How
would I
assess this? Well, in a criminal case, what I typically do is I ask myself, okay, was there a detective or an officer, the first guy at the scene? Did he notice that button or that casing or that piece of hair? If he did he take a Polaroid? I wish. Not always will they take a Polaroid. A lot of patrol officers back in those days didn't have a Polaroid in their bag. But did he take a picture, or did he write a report in which he says, yeah, I walked in, and I saw that button there, and the button had a little chip on the side, so I asked CSI to collect it. Did he in some way document what he saw? And then the next person who comes along, who takes that button out of property and brings it to the crime lab, did they write a report saying, yeah, I picked it up and I saw that chip on it too, and I brought it to the crime lab? And then the criminalists, of course, they work it and they take great pictures of it and they describe the chip on the button, and then they give it to another detective years later. He brings it into court. Here's what I have. I have a chain of custody in which I have many pictures or descriptions of that button or whatever it is over time that I can compare to one another to see, is this thing I have in trial today the same thing that was at the crime scene? That's called the chain of custody.
All right.
There's actually a chain of custody for the New Testament.
There is.
Yeah, that can tell us what is it that John wrote in that gospel. I've got a Gospel of John today. Why do I trust it? How do I know that this gospel I have today is the one that John actually wrote? How do I know how much has been inserted later? Well, one way I can test it is to simply ask, is there an officer at the scene following John, who John actually gave this information to? What does this guy say about it? What does this guy say about what John said? Turns out that John had three students. He had Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp. Well, Ignatius and Polycarp became church leaders, and we still have some of their letters in which they wrote to local churches, describing Jesus the way that they had been taught from John. So if we wonder what John was teaching in the first century, we can go to his students.
And were they exaggerating when you compare?
Yes, maybe the first thing you hear Ignatius talk about Jesus is very simple, because that's the Jesus he got from John. Now, that later Jesus who's a miracle worker, that's going to come later in history. But the first Jesus, is he simple or is he God? Then, of course, Ignatius and Polycarp, they had a student named Irenaeus. Well, he wrote a lot. We still have a lot of Irenaeus writing. We can see, what does that Polaroid look like? Then he has a student called Hippolytus. We can see, what does that student's Polaroid look like? I can compare the pictures of Jesus over time the same way I compare the pictures of the button over time, or whatever that piece of evidence is.
Because normal people do exaggerate. Like I've been at a situation where others were there, and 5 years down the road, they're telling me this story, and I'm thinking, whoa, I don't remember it being that grand.
Right, exactly.
So that's what you're worried about.
That's what I was concerned about. There's some legendary exaggeration in the Gospels. Well, it turns out that the very first officers in the chain of custody, Ignatius and Polycarp, when we look at their writings about Jesus, for example, you can follow a chain of custody through Paul, through Clement. Clement and Linus were two people he mentions in his letters. Well, Clement became a leader and a bishop in Rome. He has a letter called First Clement. So you can see, well, what does he believe about Jesus? We have first generation.
So true.
It's neat to look at those. And as you look at those, you're stuck with the Jesus that we know today.
It don't change.
Born of a virgin, worked miracles, claimed to be God, was crucified on a cross, rose from the dead to prove his deity. These are things that I would have said were the supernatural aspects I would have rejected. Well, it turns out those are the earliest descriptions of Jesus, and they don't change over history. So you're kind of stuck with having to deal with that this is a lie, it's an early lie, and it has never changed.
So to you, that's evidence.
Sure.